Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and it is time for a review of the new Spiritualized album, And Nothing Hurt. This is the latest full-length album from Jason J. Spaceman Pierce and the gang under the Spiritualized name. Truly one of the most unique and transcendental rock bands of the modern era, and their nearly 30-year trajectory as a group has been an interesting one, as so few rock bands out there have been able to so successfully embody both the future and the past in their music. Rock and roll and soul and garage have always been a foundational influence for Jason Pierce's songs, but over the years he's built on those influences with some choir-sized background vocals, lush instrumentation, and dense shoegazy sonic experiments. His humble songs about love, loss, faith, and personal turmoil are often blasted off into the stratosphere with this orchestral-sized backdrop of instrumentation. Then just add a touch of surreal and mind-bending sound play, and that is pretty much the secret sauce of Spiritualized. And we're hearing it again on this new LP, but in a somewhat diminished capacity. In some respects, Pierce does try to make this album sound grand by layering the usual instrumental suspects on top of each other, but the production quality of the best and most recent Spiritualized albums is way better. Much brighter, more spacious and panoramic, and Nothing Hurt is pretty dense, but it's a lot more narrow in its field of vision, which does leave the sound of the album feeling a bit more scaled down, even sonically smudgy at points, leaving Jason's very meager voice to get lost in the haze of instrumentation, especially on cuts like The Prize, which is kind of a shame. I do think it is one of the better cuts on the entire LP, has a very powerful song about love and mortality. And I think some of this change could be very intentional for Spiritualized, as it seems very apparent the band are shooting for something that's a bit more toned down, sleepy, intoxicating, and intimate, not quite as heavy and powerful and overwhelming and in your face. Maybe Jason is trying to put more focus on the songs themselves as opposed to the instrumentation surrounding them. It just doesn't feel like this album is trying to wow me with an IMAX-sized display of sound, but rather just woo me into a stupor that's kind of sad, kind of druggy, but still pretty powerful, with these very soft and thick rock and roll ballads, and some real art rock ragers too. The songs The Morning After and On the Sunshine heap on loads of cacophony. Just super noisy guitars, just building higher and higher and higher sonically over a pretty straightforward garage rock groove. Very familiar stomping grounds for Spiritualized. They're really wearing their Velvet Underground influence on their sleeve, as these songs very much feel like they're in the spirit of classic tracks like Sister Ray, but with way more clarity and harmony. It's just exciting bliss. It's like listening to James Brown at the Apollo, but on LSD. Then there are these depressing and, like I said before, intoxicating slow jams, which can be pretty captivating, pretty beautiful, but occasionally muddy to the point where I think it takes away some of the appeal of the song, occasionally leading to some flaccid results on a song here or there, like on the closing cut, Sail On Through, which sonically comes off very flat and gray despite the heaps of instrumentation that are thrown into the mix, which includes some drony tones, some choir vocals, and orchestral drum rolls. The song Here Comes the Road is another pretty fantastic ballad on the record, but it is hindered by these weird clicking, cycling guitar sounds that are some odd effect that really kind of distracts from the tune and isn't quite as experimental or as interesting as Pierce might have thought it was when throwing it into the song. This very same sound actually turns up on the opener too, but it's way quieter, more subtle, and I think applied much more effectively. Again, for Here Comes the Road, it's kind of an experimental blemish, but I still do like the very beautiful and straightforward blend of rock and roll and soul on this track quite a bit. Let's Dance is not a bad song on the album, though it is kind of predictable for Spiritualized at this point, a linear ballad that gets heavier and more grand in presentation as it plods along and has a pretty beautiful and harmony-rich instrumental finish, including lots of horns and some weird laser effects too. Again, nice moment on the album, but not anything Spiritualized hasn't done before, and with a much bigger presentation and better production. But honestly, the low points of this album aren't even really that low. They are relatively enjoyable at the very worst. There are a good deal of quality highlights here. The more aggressive tracks I cited earlier, the song I'm Your Man, which is a beautiful and romance-drenched rock ballad in 3/Time. A song that, looking at the chord progression and the lyrics, should have been written like 30 times over at this point. I actually thought it was a cover at first. The sound of the song and just the lyrics, it sounded so friggin' familiar. But still, it was really captivating. It was really beautiful. And of course, Spiritualized put their dense and heavy and harmonious spin on these older forms of rock songwriting. For the most part, they're doing it as well as ever. I love the touches of piano on this track too, the explosive passages of drums and harmonized guitars. The song Damaged is another dreamy and intoxicating ballad in 3, about being a very broken and dysfunctional and lost person. Themes that Jason still approaches in his lyrics with a lot of heart. The band pairs this song with some very dense and trippy layers of guitars and strings. It's actually one of the few moments where these heaps of instrumentation bleeding into one another in a kind of cacophonous way actually benefits the sound of the album quite a bit, as those strings, the electric guitars, and some bells, it sounds like too, kind of melt together in a pretty psychedelic way. The previously mentioned opening track on the album is pretty great too, another testament to Jason's love of, I guess, writing these very somber ballads in 3/4 on this particular album. And really that's kind of the bulk of the record. It's one of the shorter releases in the Spiritualized discography, 48 minutes or so, 9 tracks. A lot of the songs run out at about 4 or 5 minutes, no super dense, huge, powerful, gargantuan builds throughout this record either. Overall, I think it's a decent album. There wasn't anything overtly bad about any of it, but maybe people who haven't been fans of the band up until this point might have a hard time finding anything exciting about this record, considering there isn't a lot of intensity and thrills in the track listing here, save for a few moments. If I was recommending this band to somebody, I wouldn't necessarily throw this album in front of them first, mostly because it's not a very large or a bold statement, certainly not as grand as the band's last album, even though some people do kind of see that as a flawed record in their discography, especially not their debut, especially not Ladies and Gentlemen, vastly superior records to what Spiritualized have delivered over here. What I see this album as is the band sticking to their guns, handing audiences what they kind of expect at this point, and doing a relatively good job. Certainly this is one of the more downtrodden records in the Spiritualized discography. But despite the lack of novelty, I didn't really dislike the album, didn't really have a bad time listening to it, was still pretty captivated by a lot of the songs, thought the performances and the tunes were generally pretty passionate and beautiful. Not a whole lot to hate, but certainly not much I can say for longtime fans looking for something different, or maybe people who are new to the group too. Not things I can cite, hey, you're gonna freak out over this, really, honestly. I'm feeling a strong 6 to a light 7 on this thing. Transition, have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like, please subscribe, and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Spiritualized forever.